The suave secret agent who redefined cool, the man whose piercing blue eyes and effortless charm made him one of the most beloved James Bonds in cinema history, rose from the streets of Ireland to become Hollywood royalty. With a tuxedo that fit like armor and a smile that could disarm any villain, he dominated screens in GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, and Die Another Day, breathing new life into a franchise many thought had died with the Cold War. For decades, he stood as the embodiment of sophistication itself, a leading man who could seduce audiences with a glance and command respect with his presence alone. But behind that polished exterior lies a story drenched in tragedy. A childhood shattered by abandonment, losses so devastating they would bring the strongest man to his knees, grief that followed him through every red carpet and premiere, and the suffocating weight of maintaining an image of perfection while his world crumbled in private. And before we begin, if Pierce Brosnan ever made you believe in heroes, don't forget to hit like as tribute to the man who taught us that even the most unshakable among us carry wounds no spotlight can heal. The wound that would define everything began not with violence, but with absence. Pierce Brendan Brosnan was born on May 16, 1953, in Drogheda, County Louth, Ireland, a small town where rain fell like prayers and poverty clung to families like a second skin. His father, Thomas Brosnan, was a carpenter whose hands built structures for others while his own family crumbled beneath him. His mother, May Smith, worked as a nurse, her shifts long and her exhaustion deeper, trying to hold together what was already breaking apart. Pierce was an only child, which should have made him the center of their world, but sometimes being the only witness to collapse is the loneliest position of all. When Pierce was just 4 years old, his father walked out. Not through death, which at least offers the mercy of finality and the comfort of blamelessness, but through choice, the cruelest abandonment because it whispers that you weren't worth staying for. Thomas Brosnan simply disappeared, leaving behind a wife, a son, and questions that would echo through decades. For Pierce, barely old enough to understand permanence, his father became a ghost, a man whose absence shaped him more profoundly than his presence ever could have. The boy learned early that love is conditional, that people leave, and that sometimes you're not enough reason for them to stay. But the tragedy deepened. May, overwhelmed by single motherhood and the financial impossibility of raising a child alone, made a decision born from desperation rather than cruelty. She left Pierce with her parents and later with relatives, searching for work in London that might allow her to send money home. For Pierce, this second abandonment was devastating in ways a 4-year-old couldn't articulate but would carry forever. His mother didn't vanish completely. She visited when she could, sent letters, promised it was temporary. But to a child, absence is absence. And Pierce learned that even the people who love you will leave when circumstances demand it. He was passed between relatives like a burden no one wanted to carry permanently. Aunts and uncles took him in out of obligation rather than desire, and Pierce felt it in every uncomfortable silence, every reminder that this wasn't his real home, that he was a temporary guest wearing out his welcome. The instability was crushing. New schools where he was always the outsider, new beds that never felt safe, new families where he never quite belonged. By the time he was 11, Pierce had learned to make himself small, invisible, to survive by not asking for too much, by being grateful for scraps of affection, by understanding that permanence was a luxury other children had, but he never would. At 11 years old, Pierce Brosnan's life shifted when his mother finally sent for him. May had established herself in London, remarried, and could now provide the stability she had fought years to create. For Pierce, arriving in London in 1964 should have been a homecoming, but instead it felt like being transplanted into foreign soil. The city was massive, cold, indifferent to a boy who spoke with an Irish accent and carried the weight of abandonment like a stone in his chest. His mother was there, yes, but she was also a stranger now, reshaped by years apart, and her new husband was a man Pierce had to learn to navigate around, never quite sure where he fit in this reconstructed family. School in London offered no refuge. Pierce was the outsider again. The Irish kid with the wrong accent, the wrong clothes, the wrong everything. He struggled academically, his education fragmented by years of instability. But something unexpected happened when he stumbled into the drama department. At 13, cast in a school play, Pierce discovered that on stage he could become someone else entirely, could shed the awkward, abandoned boy and inhabit characters who were confident, loved, wanted. Theater became his sanctuary, the only place where reinvention wasn't just possible, but celebrated, where pretending to be someone else was called talent instead of survival. The discovery that would change everything came at 16 when Pierce saw a production at the Oval House Theater. Watching actors command the stage with a power that transcended their circumstances, he felt something ignite inside him, not just interest, but calling. This was what he wanted, what he needed, the only path that made sense for a boy who had spent his entire life feeling invisible. Against all practical advice, Pierce enrolled at the Drama Centre London at 18, throwing himself into training with the desperation of someone who understood this was his only shot at becoming more than the sum of his abandonments. But training didn't mean success. For years, Pierce scraped by on odd jobs, painting houses, driving cabs, anything that paid enough to survive while he chased auditions that led nowhere. The rejections were relentless, each one confirming the fear that whispered he wasn't good enough, that the abandoned Irish boy was dreaming above his station. Then, in 1982, at 29 years old, fate arrived in the form of Remington Steele, an American television series that cast him as a charming private detective. Suddenly, the invisible boy had a face the world recognized, and Pierce Brosnan learned that sometimes salvation comes not from erasing your past, but from performing your way beyond it. Success arrived like a tidal wave Pierce had no preparation for. Remington Steele premiered in 1982 and became an instant hit, turning the unknown Irish actor into American television's newest heartthrob. Women swooned over his charm, his smile, the effortless sophistication he brought to the role of a con man pretending to be a detective. The show ran for 5 seasons, and with each episode, Pierce's face became more recognizable, his name more valuable, his future seemingly limitless. At 30 years old, the boy who had been passed between relatives like unwanted cargo now graced magazine covers and commanded salaries that made poverty feel like a distant nightmare. Hollywood noticed. Film roles began arriving. The Fourth Protocol in 1987, Taffin in 1988, projects that positioned Pierce as a leading man capable of carrying movies, not just television episodes. He moved to Los Angeles, purchased a home that felt impossible compared to the cramped London flats of his youth, and began building the life he had always believed was reserved for other people. The money flowed steadily, enough to provide security he had never known, enough to prove to every relative who had treated him as temporary that he had become permanent, undeniable, impossible to overlook. But beneath the surface, old wounds festered. Fame didn't heal the abandonment. It merely gave him better tools to hide it. Pierce threw himself into work with the intensity of someone terrified that stopping meant disappearing again. That if he wasn't constantly performing, constantly proving his worth, the world would remember he was just the abandoned Irish boy pretending to belong. The schedule was punishing, 18-hour days on set, promotional tours, interviews where he smiled and charmed, while exhaustion ate him from the inside. Sleep became negotiable. Rest felt like weakness. the industry began whispering about James Bond. Pierce's name surfaced repeatedly as the ideal successor to Roger Moore, the actor who could bring both danger and charm to the iconic role. But in 1986, when the opportunity finally arrived, Remington Steele refused to release him from his contract, and the role went to Timothy Dalton instead. The disappointment was crushing, a reminder that even success carries its own forms of powerlessness, that contracts can cage you as effectively as poverty ever did. Pierce smiled through the rejection publicly, but privately it felt like abandonment wearing a different mask, something he wanted, something promised, then taken away by forces beyond his control, leaving him once again watching opportunity choose someone else. Tragedy arrived on December 28, 1991, when Pierce Brosnan's world shattered in ways no amount of fame could protect against. His wife, Cassandra Harris, whom he had married in 1980, lost her battle with ovarian cancer at just 43 years old. She had been diagnosed 4 years earlier, and Pierce had watched helplessly as the disease consumed the woman who had saved him from loneliness, who had given him not just love, but a family. Her 2 children from a previous marriage, Charlotte and Christopher, whom Pierce had adopted, and their son, together Sean. For 11 years, Cassandra had been his anchor, the person who saw past the charming actor to the abandoned boy still searching for home. And now she was gone. The grief was annihilating. Pierce had nursed her through the final stages, watching cancer strip away her strength, her hair, her ability to do the simple things that defined her. He held her hand as she died, and in that moment, every fear he had carried since childhood became reality. The people you love leave. Permanence is illusion, and no amount of success can protect you from the cruelty of loss. The funeral was attended by industry colleagues who offered condolences that meant nothing, and Pierce stood hollow, performing grief for cameras while dying inside where no one could see. What devastated him beyond the loss itself was the responsibility that remained. He was now a single father to 3 children, Charlotte 15, Christopher 14, Sean 8, all grieving their mother while looking to Pierce for stability he didn't know how to provide. He had to be strong when strength felt impossible, had to wake each morning and pretend the world still made sense when nothing made sense anymore. The children needed breakfast, needed school runs, needed a father who could function when all Pierce wanted was to disappear into the same darkness that had taken Cassandra. Work became both escape and torture. Pierce threw himself into projects to avoid the empty house, the bedroom that still smelled like her perfume, the closets full of clothes she would never wear again. But every set felt hollow, every script a reminder that he was performing life instead of living it. The industry expected him to recover quickly, to be professional, to save his grief for off-camera hours. And Pierce, trained since childhood to make himself small and accommodating, complied, smiling through interviews while suffocating in private. This wasn't just the loss of his wife. It was the confirmation that happiness, whenever he found it, would always be temporary, always waiting to be stolen by forces he couldn't fight. The years following Cassandra's death were defined by survival rather than healing. Pierce functioned because his children needed him to function, waking each morning not from desire, but from duty. He cooked breakfasts with hands that felt mechanical, drove to school drop-offs while his mind wandered to the passenger seat where Cassandra used to sit, attended parent-teacher conferences alone, and felt her absence like a physical wound. The children were grieving, but they were also watching him, learning from his example how to carry unbearable weight. And Pierce understood that collapsing wasn't an option, no matter how desperately he wanted to surrender. Work provided structure when everything else felt formless. Pierce accepted roles that kept him busy: Mrs. Doubtfire in 1993, love affair in 1994, projects that demanded his presence on set for months at a time, filling hours that would otherwise be consumed by grief. On camera, he became other people, stepped into their problems instead of his own, and for brief intervals forgot that his real life was the one waiting at home, empty and cold. But acting also felt like betrayal. Moments when he laughed at something a co-star said and then remembered Cassandra was gone, and guilt crushed him for daring to feel anything resembling joy. Then, in 1995, destiny knocked again. Timothy Dalton had stepped away from James Bond, and the role Pierce had been denied nearly a decade earlier was finally his. At 42 years old, he became the fifth actor to portray 007, stepping into a tuxedo that felt both like armor and like costume. GoldenEye was a massive success, revitalizing a franchise many had declared dead. And suddenly, Pierce Brosnan wasn't just a television actor or a grieving widower. He was James Bond, the most iconic role in cinema, the character who defined cool, confidence, and invincibility. The irony was suffocating. The world saw him as the ultimate symbol of control and sophistication, but Pierce knew the truth, that he was barely holding himself together, that the man who looked unshakable on screen went home to an empty bed and cried in the shower where his children couldn't hear. Bond gave him purpose and distraction, but it couldn't give him healing. Recovery, he was learning, wasn't about replacing what was lost or achieving enough success to outrun grief. It was about learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you, about showing up for your children, even when showing up felt impossible, about accepting that some wounds never close, but somehow, impossibly, you keep breathing anyway. The late 1990s and early 2000s belonged to Pierce Brosnan in ways that would have seemed impossible to the abandoned Irish boy. GoldenEye in 1995 shattered box office records, earning over $350 million worldwide and proving that James Bond could thrive in the post-Cold War era. Tomorrow Never Dies followed in 1997, then The World Is Not Enough in 1999, and finally, Die Another Day in 2002, 4 Bond films that collectively grossed over $1.6 billion, cementing Pierce as one of the most successful actors to ever wear the tuxedo. He wasn't just playing Bond, he had become the embodiment of elegance and danger, the face that defined the character for an entire generation. Beyond Bond, Pierce diversified brilliantly. The Thomas Crown Affair in 1999 showcased his ability to carry sophisticated thrillers outside the spy genre. Dante's Peak and The Mirror Has Two Faces proved his range extended beyond action. He commanded salaries in the tens of millions per film, his face appearing on billboards across continents. His name alone enough to greenlight projects. The boy who once drove cabs between auditions now traveled in private jets, owned properties in Malibu and Hawaii, and moved through the world with the kind of security wealth provides. At his peak, Pierce was earning over $15 million per Bond film, plus back-end profits that multiplied his income exponentially. The empire extended beyond acting, producing credits, endorsement deals, investments that turned millions into more millions. He purchased a stunning oceanfront home in Malibu, where waves crashed against rocks and privacy shielded him from the relentless gaze of fame. The mansion was everything poverty had denied him: space, beauty, permanence. To the world, Pierce Brosnan had conquered everything. But success couldn't resurrect what he had lost. Every premiere, every award ceremony, every moment of triumph carried Cassandra's absence like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He walked red carpets alone, smiled for cameras that captured only surface, and returned to homes filled with everything except the person who had made them feel like home. His children were growing, Charlotte and Christopher navigating adulthood, Sean becoming a teenager, and Pierce was present in ways his own parents never were. But presence couldn't erase the grief they all carried. At night, standing on his Malibu deck watching the Pacific stretch endlessly, Pierce understood the cruelest truth, that you can have everything the world offers and still feel hollow, that success is a poor substitute for love, and that no amount of applause fills the silence where someone's voice used to be. Loneliness, Pierce discovered, doesn't disappear just because you're famous. For years after Cassandra's death, he remained single, unable to imagine replacing the woman who had understood him completely, who had seen the abandoned boy beneath the actor and loved him anyway. Dating felt like betrayal. Moving forward felt like forgetting. But isolation has its own cruelty. And by the late 1990s, Pierce was drowning in a life filled with everything except companionship, surrounded by luxury, but suffocating in emptiness that no award could fill. In 1994, 3 years after Cassandra's death, Pierce met Keely Shea Smith, an American journalist and television correspondent, at a beach party in Mexico. She was different from the actresses and models who circulated through Hollywood events, grounded, intelligent, carrying her own ambitions rather than seeking to attach herself to his. Their connection developed slowly, carefully, both of them scarred by loss and cautious about risking their hearts again. Keely had never been married, carried no illusions about what loving a movie star required, and most importantly, she didn't try to replace Cassandra, but instead honored her memory while building something new. They married in 2001 at Ballintubber Abbey in Ireland, Pierce returning to his homeland for vows that felt more like promises to finally stop running from happiness. Together, they had 2 sons, Dylan in 1997 and Paris in 2001. And Pierce, now in his late 40s, had another chance at building the family stability that had always eluded him. With Keely, he found something he hadn't known since Cassandra: partnership that didn't demand he perform perfection, a companion who saw his grief and didn't ask him to hide it, a woman strong enough to love a man still carrying ghosts. But marriage, even to someone as understanding as Keely, couldn't erase the fractures. Pierce's work schedule remained relentless through the Bond years, months away filming on location, while Keely managed their young sons and Pierce's older children from his first marriage. The absences strained them, not with infidelity or cruelty, but with the simple exhaustion of building connection across distance. Phone calls replaced conversations. Reunions felt like starting over each time, and Pierce, carrying the terror of loss, sometimes pulled away emotionally, protecting himself from the possibility of loving someone so much that losing them would destroy him again. The pattern was unconscious but damaging, getting close, then retreating, giving Keely enough to keep her, but never everything, always holding something back in case abandonment returned, wearing a different face. The fall, when it came, felt like betrayal dressed in business language. In 2004, after 4 wildly successful Bond films that had revitalized the franchise and earned over $1.6 billion worldwide, producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson informed Pierce that his services were no longer required. At 51 years old, he was being replaced by Daniel Craig, a younger, grittier actor who would take Bond in a darker direction. The decision was presented as creative evolution, but Pierce heard it as the same message he'd been receiving since childhood. You're not enough, you're replaceable, and when we're done with you, we'll simply choose someone else. The rejection was devastating in ways that transcended professional disappointment. Pierce had poured himself into Bond, using the role as both armor and therapy during the years following Cassandra's death. He had been the face of the franchise for nearly a decade, had done everything producers asked, had delivered commercially and critically. And now, without warning or ceremony, he was discarded. The public learned of his firing through entertainment news rather than through private conversation, adding public humiliation to private hurt. Headlines speculated that he was too old, too soft, too associated with the campy Bond rather than the edgy reinvention the franchise demanded. Pierce handled the rejection with public grace, smiling through interviews and wishing Daniel Craig well. But privately, the wound cut deep. Every premiere of Craig's Bond films felt like watching someone else live the life that should have been his. Casino Royale became a massive critical and commercial success, earning praise for exactly the qualities producers had implied Pierce lacked. The industry's message was clear. Pierce Brosnan's Bond was obsolete, a relic of a pre-9/11 world that no longer resonated, and he was too old to reinvent himself into whatever came next. Offers dried up in the aftermath. Studios saw him as former Bond rather than as a versatile actor, and the roles that arrived were pale imitations of the sophistication he'd embodied, forgettable thrillers, supporting parts in films that went straight to streaming. The phone that once rang constantly with offers now sat silent for days. For a man who had spent his entire life fighting invisibility, becoming professionally invisible again at 50 was its own kind of death. This wasn't just losing a role. It was being told your time had passed, that the industry had extracted everything valuable and was now moving on without you. Loss has a way of returning in waves, each one more devastating than the last. In 2013, Pierce Brosnan received news that shattered what remained of his carefully reconstructed life. His daughter Charlotte, whom he had adopted when he married Cassandra and loved as his own, had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. The same disease that had killed her mother 22 years earlier was now consuming her at just 41 years old. For Pierce, the diagnosis felt like history, repeating itself with cruel precision. A nightmare he had already lived through now, forcing him to endure it again, helpless to stop what he knew was coming. Charlotte fought with everything she had, but cancer is merciless. Pierce watched as the vibrant woman who had survived losing her mother at 15 now faced the same fate, and the helplessness was suffocating. He had been unable to save Cassandra. Now he was unable to save Charlotte. All the wealth, all the fame, all the resources money could buy meant nothing against cells that multiplied without mercy. He sat with her through treatments, held her hand through the terror, and watched her body betray her exactly as her mother's had. On June 28, 2013, Charlotte died, leaving behind her husband and 2 children. Pierce attended another funeral, stood before another casket, and buried another piece of his heart. The grief was compounded by familiarity. He knew these rituals had performed this morning before, and the repetition made it somehow worse. 2 women he loved, both stolen by the same disease, both leaving holes nothing could fill. The world saw James Bond at a funeral, but Pierce was just a father who had failed to protect his daughter, a man whose presence hadn't been enough to keep death away. The loss triggered a health reckoning Pierce could no longer ignore. At 60, carrying decades of grief and the physical toll of stunts and stress, his body began demanding attention. His heart required monitoring. Sleep, already fractured by nightmares and memories, became nearly impossible without help. The weight of watching 2 people he loved die the same way left scars that manifested physically. Chest pains that sent him to doctors, exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure, a body keeping score of every loss and finally presenting the bill. Health became the mirror, reflecting every wound he'd tried to outrun. And Pierce learned that grief doesn't just live in the mind. It settles into bones, muscles, and organs, becoming part of the body's permanent architecture. Charlotte's death in 2013 was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a pattern of loss that had stalked Pierce Brosnan for decades, as if fate had decided that love, for him, would always come with an expiration date. But the cruelty didn't end with Charlotte. In the years that followed, Pierce watched helplessly as his adopted son Christopher, Charlotte's brother, spiraled into struggles that no father's love could seem to arrest. Christopher battled personal demons that manifested in ways Pierce couldn't fully reach, challenges that left him estranged at times, drifting through life without the anchor their mother had once provided and Pierce tried desperately to be. The weight of being a father to children who had lost their mother so young, then watching one succumb to the same disease that had killed her, left Pierce carrying guilt that had no resolution. He replayed every moment. Had he been present enough after Cassandra died? Had his career stolen time Charlotte and Christopher needed? Could he have somehow prevented the patterns that formed in grief's wake? The questions tortured him because they had no answers, only the devastating reality that doing your best doesn't always protect the people you love from suffering. His relationship with his biological son Sean carried its own complexities. Sean had been only 8 when Cassandra died, and Pierce had raised him through adolescence while simultaneously grieving and working relentlessly. They shared a bond, but it was one built around absence as much as presence. Pierce there physically, but often emotionally elsewhere, still carrying Cassandra, still processing Charlotte, still trying to be strong when strength felt like performance. Sean grew into adulthood, understanding his father loved him, but also recognizing that Pierce's heart was a crowded place, filled with ghosts that left little room for the living. With his younger sons, Dylan and Paris, born from his marriage to Keeley, Pierce tried desperately to be different, more present, more emotionally available, less haunted. But trauma doesn't disappear because you want it to. There were moments when Pierce looked at them and saw fragility instead of potential, saw future loss instead of present joy, his mind unable to trust that happiness could last. Keeley watched him struggle, holding space for his grief, while also trying to pull him back to the family that still needed him alive. Not just physically present, but emotionally engaged. The lesson was brutal. You can survive unimaginable loss and still be breathing, but surviving and living are not the same thing. And sometimes the ghosts we carry take up so much space, there's barely room left for those still here. By the mid-2000s, Pierce Brosnan understood that continuing down the same path meant drowning in grief that would never release him. At 62 years old, having buried his wife and daughter to the same disease, watching his adopted son struggle, and carrying decades of loss like stones in his pockets, he faced a choice. Let the weight pull him under, or find a way to transform suffering into something that honored those he'd lost, rather than simply mourning them endlessly. The shift began not with grand gestures, but with quiet commitments. Pierce became an advocate for cancer research, particularly ovarian cancer, channeling his rage and helplessness into funding and awareness campaigns. He couldn't save Cassandra or Charlotte, but perhaps his resources and platform could help save someone else's wife, someone else's daughter. The work was painful. Every speech about the disease forced him to relive their deaths, but it gave his grief purpose beyond paralysis, transformed his loss into action that might prevent others from experiencing the same devastation. He redirected energy toward environmental causes, becoming a vocal advocate for ocean conservation and climate action. The activism wasn't escapism, but connection. Pierce fighting for a world his grandchildren and great-grandchildren might inherit, ensuring that something would outlast him beyond memories and mourning. He used his fame strategically now, not for vanity, but for leverage, understanding that celebrity could be weaponized for causes that mattered more than any film role ever would. With Keeley and their sons Dylan and Paris, Pierce worked consciously to be present in ways trauma had made difficult. He attended their school events, prioritized family dinners over industry gatherings, and most importantly, allowed them to see his vulnerability rather than only his strength. He spoke openly with his sons about grief, about Cassandra, about Charlotte, refusing to pretend the past didn't exist, but also refusing to let it consume the present. The transformation wasn't about forgetting. It was about integration, carrying loss without being crushed by it. Professionally, Pierce chose roles that reflected his evolution. He embraced character parts over leading man vanity, playing flawed fathers and aging men wrestling with mortality. Roles that allowed him to channel his pain into performances that felt honest rather than heroic. The work became cathartic rather than escapist, art as processing rather than pretending. What emerged wasn't the unshakable James Bond, but something more valuable, a man who had survived what should have destroyed him and chose daily to keep showing up for the people who remained, proving that transformation isn't about erasing scars, but learning to live with them carved into your skin. At 71 years old, Pierce Brosnan has built a life that honors both survival and memory. The Malibu oceanfront home remains his primary sanctuary, a place where the Pacific stretches endlessly and privacy shields him from the relentless machinery of fame. He still works, but the frantic pace of the Bond years has been replaced by selective purpose, choosing projects that interest him rather than ones that validate him, appearing in films like The Sun and Black Adam, not to prove relevance, but because the roles speak to something genuine within him. With a net worth estimated around $200 million, financial security allows Pierce the freedom to prioritize meaning over money. He produces through his company, Irish Dreamtime, develops projects that reflect his values rather than chasing commercial trends, and turns down far more offers than he accepts. The mansion, the art collection, the properties across multiple continents, all of it provides comfort, but no longer defines him. Wealth, he learned through decades of loss, cannot purchase what matters most, cannot bring back the people whose absence still echoes through every room. His marriage to Keeley has endured over 2 decades, weathering storms that destroy weaker unions. She has been his anchor through Charlotte's death, through professional rejection, through the ongoing challenge of loving a man who carries more ghosts than most people can imagine. They've grown older together, Keeley facing public scrutiny about her weight and appearance with dignity, while Pierce has defended her fiercely, proving that his love doesn't require her to remain frozen in youth's image. Their sons Dylan and Paris, now in their 20s, have grown into men shaped by both their father's presence and his pain, understanding that legacy includes both triumph and tragedy. Health requires constant attention now. Pierce maintains strict routines, exercise that keeps his body functional, regular medical checkups that monitor the toll of 71 years, vigilance around the diseases that have stolen too much already. When asked about retirement, he deflects. But the truth is visible. He's slowing down not from lack of desire, but from respect for what his body and spirit can still sustain. These days, Pierce moves through the world with the quiet authority of someone who has survived what should have destroyed him. The Pierce who plays with his grandchildren carries different weight than the Pierce who once wore Bond's tuxedo. And the difference is wisdom earned through unbearable tuition. Pierce Brosnan's journey from abandoned Irish child to Hollywood icon spans 7 decades of triumph shadowed by unimaginable loss. 4 Bond films that collectively earned over $1.6 billion, dozens of acclaimed performances across genres, and a career that redefined what it meant to embody sophistication on screen. The numbers tell one story. But the deeper narrative is written in the spaces between achievements, in the funeral services attended, in the hospital rooms where he held dying hands, in the quiet moments when success felt hollow, because the people who made it meaningful were gone. He transformed the Bond franchise by bringing vulnerability beneath the armor, a humanity that resonated because it was genuine. Pierce understood what it meant to perform strength while breaking inside, to maintain composure when everything was falling apart. His influence extends beyond cinema into cultural definitions of masculinity itself, proving that elegance and emotional depth aren't contradictory, that real men carry grief without letting it define them, that sophistication includes the courage to love again after devastating loss. The tragedies, Cassandra's death, Charlotte's death, professional rejection, the ongoing struggles of his extended family, add weight that prevents his legacy from being mere celebrity mythology. His losses reveal that wealth cannot insulate against life's cruelest blows, that fame offers no immunity from grief, that even James Bond bleeds when the people he loves are stolen by forces no action hero can fight. These failures don't diminish his achievements. They illuminate them, showing that his greatest performances weren't on screen, but in choosing to keep living after loss that should have destroyed him. What endures beyond the films is the image of resilience, not the manufactured kind that denies pain, but the authentic kind that acknowledges devastation and continues anyway. Audiences remember not just the tuxedo and the martinis, but the man who buried his wife and daughter to the same disease and still found reasons to smile, to work, to love again. What survives is proof that you can lose almost everything and still choose presence over paralysis, that grief and joy can coexist, that the strongest among us aren't those who never fall, but those who rise despite carrying weight that never fully lifts. Pierce Brosnan's life demonstrates that surviving tragedy doesn't mean transcending it. It means learning to carry it with grace. That legacy includes both what we achieve and what we endure, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is simply keep showing up for the people who remain when every instinct screams to disappear. At 72, Pierce Brosnan carries weight that no tuxedo could ever conceal. From the abandoned boy passed between Irish relatives to the man who embodied Bond's invincibility to the father who buried his wife and daughter to the same merciless disease, he has traveled roads where triumph and tragedy walk hand in hand. The blue eyes that once made millions swoon now carry depths earned through losses that would have shattered weaker men. And what remains is not the polished secret agent, but a survivor who chose love again despite knowing its cost. His story reminds us that resilience isn't the absence of breaking, but the courage to keep living after you've shattered. That grief doesn't disappear, but can coexist with joy. And that the truest strength is showing up for those who remain when everything inside you wants to disappear. If Pierce Brosnan ever made you believe in second chances, what moment stays with you? Share your memories below and leave a like as tribute to the man who proved that even heroes bleed.